fabulous questions. The session we did was flip side of failing, and you know who you are. You asked some pretty awesome questions. And so I wanted to get back to you right away. So let me just call up the questions as we ask them, and that way you can see them. And because sometimes my answers are pretty detailed. So just in case I kind of get down into the weeds with a question, you can still see what that core question is. All right. Do you think that having a celebratory mindset around failure may impact your mental approach to success? 100%. Thank you, David, for asking this question. Really, when we lean into failure, it means that we set a completely different bar in terms of our target. In other words, we don't feel like we necessarily have to focus and fixate on the outcome. Instead, we can be really curious about the process. One of the big challenges that we have is we have an achievement oriented society. We set big goals. We think we have to constantly be striving for these, the next frontier, the next job, the next house, the next car, when in actual fact, we miss the extraordinary that happens in our ordinary personal lives and professional lives. And so what we really want to be able to do is focus on those small markers of success. In fact, for our group, we're going to be getting back into that in our virtual session that we're going to do in 2 weeks from now. But in the meantime, though, David, I really want to encourage you to think about the research that we've learned about habit formation. Some great work out of Stanford University is showing, as they call it, the tiny habits phenomenon, where the smallest increment of success is what we want to achieve. So if we want to start celebrating failure, rather than we have to completely shift our team's culture where we're all thrilled about it, the very next thing, the smallest habit might be adding as the first item on the agenda, what's something that didn't work well that you learned about? You could do that just like that, put it on the agenda. You don't have to figure out how to have that conversation. You don't even have to know who's going to be at that meeting. You don't have to sort out which system it's going to be on. You just know that that's your very next step. And then you can kind of think about, how do I want to approach this celebration as a leader or as an individual contributor, encouraging this culture where we can celebrate it. So that's one thing I would say is focus on making progress in the smallest increment of success. And then the philosophy is you just get 1% better. You get a little bit more celebratory with your folks, a little bit more and a little bit more. Are we 1% better at celebrating failure than we were previously, last year? Great, you're making progress, and progress is key. We don't like failure as in our culture. We often shy away from acknowledging it. We don't think it's professional. We don't let ourselves off the hook. It is the most normal, natural, and connective factor that brings us together as humans. And so acknowledging that, finding some way to make it normal and natural and just part of who we are as humans, that in and of itself simply allows us to be able to celebrate and acknowledge it. So I hope that that's helpful around how you actually can have a success approach by celebrating failure. We're going to get more into celebration in the next question, in a future question. All right. Fenny asked, how do you deal with procrastination? So really great question, because we can feel like failures if we wait till the last minute, or if somebody reports to us, an individual contributor, and they're having a hard time getting started on something, especially if we don't find that challenge ourselves. And here's what I know to be true by raising two very different kids, one with a number of challenges and the other one without. Well, all of the trusted adults that helped us with our child who had things like learning disabilities, learning exceptionalities, ADHD, and so forth, we learned that there's executive functioning skills, some of which our child has a lot of, and some of which are greater challenges. Same with our other child that seemingly on the surface has no challenges. Some of the 11 executive functioning skills are more challenging. Side note, anyone who'd like this, I have an executive functioning tool that I put together so you can evaluate yourselves. You can use it with your teams. Pop me an email, Sarah with an H at greatnessmagnified.com, and just put in the subject line, executive functioning skills questionnaire, and I'll just forward it to you. The bottom line is task initiation, which is a form of procrastination, is one of 11 executive functioning skills. If you or somebody on your team struggles with getting started, that is just like what we talked about with the first question about starting small habits. How can you or the people who report to you get started? Because once you get started, people who procrastinate usually very good to go. The other thing that I would look at, and there's a lot of research about people who are kind of like early birds and night owls. They call them larks versus owls. And I know it seems like that's not really very evidence based, but they actually have studied people's circadian rhythms. Some people can get going right away. They can produce something by lunchtime because you ask them. Other people are going to need a little bit more lead time and they do their best work at 2 in the morning. So we also have to think about how our team or how our work with individuals, how they function under deadlines. And when we give people certain requests at certain times of the day and with different amounts of lead time, it may impact their output. So, bottom line is understand if task initiation is an issue, deal with that if that's the case. If somebody is not getting the work done, the next layer of that, Fenny, I would suggest is find out if there's confusion about what's expected. Brene Brown has some really great, I don't have her book handy, but if you've read the book Dare to Lead, if you haven't, highly recommend it. She has a system that she uses with the people, the 20 plus members of her team, called TASC. So basically it helps, and I'm happy to again, if you want to reach out to me, Sarah with an H at greatnessmagnified.com. I'll take a picture, send you that, or you may want to grab that book. But the bottom line is, she has this formula, this accountability formula, to make sure she doesn't ask anybody to do something that they don't have full control and ability to be able to do. And so this TASC stands for 4 different questions. In fact, let me pull them out. I have this folder called models. These are the models that I use with my coaching clients all the time. And I really want to find those questions and read them to you. Hold on, talk amongst yourselves while I find these questions. I have a number of awesome models. Okay, here it is. T stands for who owns the task. A is, do they have the authority to be held accountable? S is, do we agree that they are set up for success? In other words, they have the time, resources, and clarity to be able to be successful. And C of TASC is, do we have a checklist of what needs to happen to accomplish the task? Fenny, I read you that because sometimes it's not procrastination, it's confusion that's the issue. Or it's the lack of accountability. I don't know what I'm accountable for. People don't hold me accountable, or they haven't been held accountable before they started working to you. So it's important to know, what issue are we dealing with? When you deal with the right issue, then you can have much greater success. All right. Next question is from Tanisha. I hope I pronounced your name right. Oh no, sorry, Gabriella. Which of your books would you recommend I read first? Well, it depends on what book, what your topic is. Of course, Flip Side of Failing comes from a book of the same name. And shout out, by the way, to Canadian designer and branding guru Azadeh for that. If you're looking for more book about how do you appreciate people, and this kind of relates to Fenny's question about how can I see the greatness in people even when they're not showing it themselves, the Forever Recognize Others Greatness may be a better option. This is actually my latest book, Rockstar. So for those of you working, I know many of you in the organization that I work with, that you serve people in healthcare. And so that's specifically Rockstar, Magnifying Your Greatness in Times of Change. Has lots of examples that are specifically from healthcare, written in the context of COVID. Certainly works outside of just that industry and outside of COVID, but those would be 3 of the books. And it kind of depends on which question do you have, what solution are you looking for. Recognition is the first focus, the first book that I created, and actually there's a workbook that goes along with it. Those would be those 2 that go together, is really how do you appreciate people. Flip Side is Failing, how do you unconditionally recognize people, including when things aren't going well. And then Rockstar is specifically about how do you do that when times are constantly changing. All right, next question. How would you recommend you build a resource network so that you can fail with grace in a safe space? This is an individual who's in a manager and training program and is at the beginning of her career and wants to learn from mistakes. So, oh my gosh, I wish I had been asking this question at the beginning of my career. Instead, it was perfectionitis all over the place. So here's what I would say. You have your people. You're always going to have your trusted advisors. And I would recommend figuring out who they are. Some are going to be at work. Some are going to be from your academic career. Some of them will be friends and family outside. They are always your go-to people. They're the folks that if you are up against a wall of not sure, how do I make a choice? Which option is best for me? These are your people that you trust. It is not necessarily always the people who have the desk over to you or that you report to or that report to you. I mean, those folks are great, and trust is it's a precarious thing. It's trust is all about I give faith to you before you've earned it. And when it comes to failure, given that the stakes are so high in our culture, that oftentimes we need to walk before we run. I'm going to trust you with something to see if you have earned that trust that I have in you. So I'm not going to share my biggest failure, my biggest challenge, my biggest roadblock, the most painful failure I've ever had to deal with in my life until I know that you've been able to handle this smaller thing with grace and have been able to respect me. So I would say, know your safe people. You say your trusted advisor, counsel first, have it, honor it, protect it, and then slowly expand your circle based on people who have demonstrated that you've earned their trust, they've earned your trust. And remember, the more you can be vulnerable with them and share your failures, the things that you're struggling with, the things you still have to learn, the more likely they're going to let you in too. So you co-create a shared safe space. The other thing is when somebody trusts you enough to share a failure with you, even if you want to go, oh my gosh, unless they're breaking a major policy, they've broken a law, like it's huge. Be so careful with their confidence, because once you break their confidence once, the safe space for you and them has completely fallen apart. Trust me, I know from somebody who did high risk mediations in my last job. I've coached over 300 leaders. And often I'm the one who's asked at the end of a keynote really quietly about how people can navigate their way through some of the situations where the space is not safe. Whatever you can do to create it means that you're not only creating it for other people, you're actually expanding your circle of safe spaces from there. All right. Next question was from somebody anonymously. Exciting. Okay, can you provide more concrete steps in acknowledging, improving my response to failure and others' failure? So really concrete steps would be when let's say you're participate in a meeting, you lead a meeting, you deliver a presentation, you can do what some of my colleagues and I would do, including when people reported to me, we would still engage in this practice. It became just part of our cultural architecture, shall I say, in our team, is we talked about 3 things that worked well. Even if there was an abysmal failure, oh my gosh, we wish we could hide under the blankets and wish that we could do a redo for the day. We still talked about 3 things that worked well. Once you talk about 3 things that worked well, then you're allowed to talk about 3 things that you would do differently. And you have to get pretty discerning if you're only allowed to say 3, or if you want another thing that needs to be improved, you have to find one other thing that worked well. It can be small things like I didn't run screaming from the room, or that person who bit my head off, I was able to take a deep breath for a few minutes before I reacted strongly. The point is, we need to be able to first acknowledge what's worked well before we start focusing on what didn't work well and where the failure was. This is where the learnings are hidden. And when we can see that not everything was a disaster, we also can get motivated enough to go back out into the ring and go for another round. When we only see what didn't work well, it's very hard to keep going. In fact, there's some really great research. Dr. Robert Cialdini, his book Persuasion. When you don't completely finish something, you're more likely to be motivated to keep it going. So here's what I would suggest. When you have one of those conversations, or let's say you leave it open at the end of a meeting, there are some things, no doubt, in this meeting you felt worked really well. And there's some things that probably didn't work as well. We're going to come at the beginning of our next meeting. I'm going to invite you to talk about one thing that worked well and one thing that you would like to improve in this meeting that didn't go as well in the next meeting. In other words, you prime people, you persuade them for talking about successes and failures, the whole continuum, which of course leads to overall more successful meetings, conversations, relationships in the end, because you're priming people that some things will work well, some things won't work so well, but that's okay, because that is part of the way we do things around here, as part of the shared experience of being human. I hope that helps. So that's some concrete steps. Reflect as well for yourself. When I first started my business, I would fixate on all the things I hadn't done yet and all the things I needed to do. And I started a practice where I would just I actually grabbed frog post-it notes, but I don't know why I randomly have this. This is enterprise grant. Anyway, post-it notes. Grab a thing of post-it notes and write one thing you want to acknowledge every single day. And you can grab another color and say, what's one thing that didn't work so well? And then grab another post-it note color and say, what's one big learning? So you can force yourself, you can do it through a journal. There's all kinds of ways that you can find a way to lean into that, to the learning. And what do you get excited about in all of those learnings? Rather than focus on what didn't work well, shifting the lens to how do I carry that forward into the future? The future-oriented focus, which comes out of a solution-focused approach, way more energizing than getting fixated on the current or the past. The past, it's in the rearview mirror. We're not going that way. So we might as well focus on the future. All right, next question. How can we speak to others regarding failures if they're being really hard on themselves? I love this question, Melanie. Oh my God, such a great question. I would honor it. I would say, I would acknowledge something in them that they're not seeing in themselves in that moment. They're not seeing themselves as resourceful and whole and completely justified in their struggles or their challenges. So what I would recommend is that you share it with them, that you see their greatness of fill in the blank. And then the more you can acknowledge and you can see that there's some strength, that you acknowledge their greatness, they're more likely they're going to be able to see it. Now, they may be very humble. We are a humble people. Those of you who are Canadian, fellow Canadian, I can tell you, I understand. We are a humble lot. And the more we can make sure that we keep the faith, we keep acknowledging, wait a minute, I know you're being really hard on yourself. And I see this as you worked really hard. You tried that. You took a risk. You were so caring and compassionate. You were very patient. Find something you can acknowledge in them, so that then they can kind of move past that initial, the pain and the hardship of disappointment, because really that's what it is. Sometimes a strong push away reaction to failure through rejecting that experience by being hard on ourselves actually allows us to put up some defenses, to look inwards and to process it. Don't let people put up the barriers, because what it also, not only are they putting up the barriers to the pain, they're putting up the barriers to them being able to see their greatness as well. And so, I strongly recommend that you consider, showing that other person how you see their greatness already. All right, what is the next question on our agenda? So this is what we just asked. All right. How can we help a friend? Yes. How can we help an associate, so a staff member, or a friend, family member who does not see the good in failure? Well, you don't have to be like the biggest advocate. You don't have to try to convince them that failure is great, especially if they're first family. In other words, how they grew up. If they don't feel like failure was okay, there's nothing you're going to be able to say or do in that moment to convince them, like, they've seen the light, now they love it. However, you can acknowledge how grateful you are for how they handled that situation. You can notice something that allowed them to, that maybe allows them to not see it as quite as as strongly as they see it, because of course things that we experience personally, naturally we're going to have a harder time with that. So what I would say is just it kind of like what we talked about with the last question. Acknowledge what you see in there and what their strengths are, and also be patient, be kind. Let them have a little bit of time with the concept that all is not lost, and that if the more you share something vulnerable with yourself, how you experienced something similar, or maybe it wasn't the same thing, however, you've experienced something difficult that was challenging. If you go first, then people are more likely to be not only to go next, but perhaps even contemplate the idea that a failure is not an absolute abysmal, um, knock on their professionalism, their character, their abilities, their professionalism, and so forth. Great questions. All right. Last question I have on the list, Cassandra, as a leader, how do we coach our teams to take risks and do things that they have never done before without a fear of failure? Well, having that learner curiosity as a leader, believing that in fact the best innovation, the best improvements are going to come from understanding what worked, what didn't go well. So constantly be curious about the process. This didn't work well and we didn't see that coming. What do you think we need to understand that we didn't know had it not been for this? I want to share with you a personal example. The beginning of COVID, I had in the first week 15, I believe it is, 15 speaking engagements that were canceled or put on hold. And I was devastated. I'm a recognition expert. I try very hard in my coaching to help people see the positives, and I was feeling like a total failure. How did I build a business that was that fragile, and I didn't see this epidemic, not this health epidemic coming, to put in some contingency planning? And I immediately went into reactive mode. Now, granted, I was willing to fail forward. I put a whole bunch of cast a whole bunch of lines to see which line people would bite on, where they were hungry, and was able to pivot the business very quickly. But I'll tell you, there were moments where I just sat in that place of huge failure. And what really helped was having other people who were in there with me. And that's really surrounding myself with other speakers, with other trainers, other consultants who were taking some risks as well, who wouldn't judge me if some of the things that I tried didn't work out, and that were willing to go with me and be honest with me about their struggles, also their successes. They could be happy for me with my successes. They could sort of commiserate with me in struggles. And I think we can do that when it comes to teams as well, is that we can have very honest conversations about the surprise that of something not working, the disappointment about losing a great customer, the frustration of having a complaint mounted, and exploring together what to do about it. How did this help us learn something? Why did we not see this coming doesn't have to be a judgment. In fact, you may recall there's some really powerful accept questions that we can ask ourselves in this learning process. If you have the book, it's page 47. So to get out of that negative accuse mode, where we're failure resistant, where we ask questions of ourselves and others like, who needs to answer to this? How do I get what I want? Or how do we get what we want still? How do I or we save face? Why didn't I see this coming? Or why didn't we see this coming? Why bother? Why did this break? You could probably see how those are questions that don't allow us to break free of the fear of failure. Instead, if we ask questions like, what can we learn from this? What options are available? How can this bond or unite? How could this have been expected? Maybe we could have seen this coming, or maybe this was coming all along. What's the best way forward? What is most important long term? ACCEPT, acquire, choice, connection, expect, progress, transformation. When we ask failure resilient questions, we together as a team are more resilient. Our team's more resilient. Failure doesn't hold us back. It gets us curious, problem identifiers, solution finders, and reinventors of some things that may have been there all along. Failure has this beautiful way of lowering the waterline on cracks that existed already. When we are able to together and collectively see that there are some challenges that we didn't notice before, it is really empowering together as a team to find and co-create solutions that we maybe wouldn't have otherwise. I hope that was helpful. Please let me know what other questions you have. Email me, Sarah with an H at greatnessmagnified.com. Happy to do another video recording for you. In the meantime, I am so incredibly grateful that you are willing to explore the flip side of failing, and that you do what you do as a failure resilient rock star.